In today's floral illustration tutorial, we are going step by step through my process for drawing anemones. So let's get started. Hi guys, welcome back. My name is Shayda Campbell, and today we are going to work through the anemone flower. I will be using two pens, the Pigma Micron 05 and the 01, so a fairly large nib and a smaller nib. And we are going to start with some practice, some rough work. I think that's always a good idea, and then we'll do a final piece. So the anemone is one that I think we doodle all the time on the channel. You start with this big round circle and then all those wonderful little lines fanning out and then all these tiny dots at the tip of those lines. The anemone has this wonderful stamen that's so detailed. Then you're going to do that top petal, bottom petal, a right and left hand petal. And then, is this looking familiar? If you're a fan of the channel, we've doodled this so many times. And then you're gonna fill in those last four petals in behind. And then of course you can add a little bit of line shading. I like to add some lines as details on the petals and then underneath here where they meet to show a little bit of shadow. It can even get simpler, like it could just be the round stamen, four petals, four more petals in behind, and maybe a bit of line shading. So I think this flower is the basis for a lot of flowers that we love to doodle because it has that great stamen and just this big flourish of petals. So let's move on and do this in a little more detail. We're going to start with a circle for the center of the stamen, but we're not going to make it a perfect circle. Nothing in nature is perfect, so you want a little imperfect. And then we start doing those lines that fan outward. You might want to draw a circle to guide you. If you're doing this flower on the bit of an angle, which I am, it's not completely flat or it's not a completely flat overhead view. The ones in back will be shorter and the ones in front longer. Then you can place your petals and you can just give yourself a map there. And then once you've laid down your guide, then start figuring out the shape of each petal. Each petal might have a little indent or come to a point. So lay down the guide first, then the petal shape, and then we place these other petals in behind. Let's go over this in pen so you can really see. We're going to make that circle for the center of the stamen. And then I like to do a bunch of lines all sort of meeting in the center, all going inward, and they don't quite meet in the center, which leaves a little bit of a highlight. Of course, I'm not doing everything right on center. As I said, I'm not drawing this as a complete flat 2D top-down view. I'm putting it on just a slight angle. I like to do a little bit of a squiggly line around the edge of that round part, and then just to make it imperfect, and then I go along and I fan out all these little lines. The lines in behind on the top of the stamen touch this round part and the ones on the bottom do not. So leave a little white line in there, a little negative space. That's just a beautiful detail. I think there is a little bit of a yellow color that usually would lie there on the flower if you see a photo, and so that's what I'm trying to capture here. It's just a bit of color variation by leaving that white line. But of course you don't see that white line in behind at the back. And I'm doing all those dots. And like I said, this flower has a wonderful stamen. And then I am going over my petals in pen, and of course I laid down the guide in pencil, then I made the shape of each petal in pencil, and then I'm going over it in pen. So by the time I go over it in pen, I really don't have anything to worry about. I know what I'm doing, I know what I want it to look like. And let's get rid of all those pencil marks because it can be a little smudgy and hard to see what you're doing, especially as you begin to line shade. So now I'll take that smaller nib, the 01, and I am going to start doing some line shading. And I like to do some shading on each petal to sort of show the shape and texture of the petal. So of course the lines indicate a certain amount of texture, but they also will show the way that petal is moving. So I have all these broken curved lines and they sort of mirror or follow the lines of the petal or the outline of each petal. So that helps with the shape to develop develop the shape and make the flower look a little more three-dimensional. And then of course we add even more lines underneath those first 5 petals to show that there's shadow there, to show that they're sitting underneath or that these other ones are sitting on top. So you can see I just keep going along and adding more and more lines, and it's up to you how much of this you really want to take on. Since we are doing a rough work page here with the anemones, I want to talk a little about perspective and depth. And anytime we try to achieve any amount of perspective and depth in a drawing, we're trying to take something that's two-dimensional, this drawing, this sketch, and make it appear three-dimensional, make it appear as it would to the human eye. And we do this often through the practice of foreshortening, and we shorten parts of an object like a flower, because when items either come towards us or recede away from us, parts of them are shortened, parts of them appear shorter. Picture a person holding out their hand towards you. You don't see the entirety of the arm becomes very, very short. And so that's what I want to play around with here with these anemones, and I am just sort of sketching them really rough, and I'm trying to shorten those petals that are right in the front, and I'm kind of playing around with that in my sketchbook and just experimenting. Perspective always gives me a little bit of trouble, especially when it comes to natural items like flowers. I'm better off with things that are square or angular. I tend to have more fun with those, but flowers can be tricky, and that's why I can't recommend enough just giving yourself the freedom to play a little bit. And you can see these petals in front here, how much I've shortened them. They've become nothing more than a tiny outline, and then the petals in the back or at the back of the flower, they're still all there. You're seeing the length, you're seeing the entirety of that petal. So I'm just trying different things, making some petals in the front really short and experimenting, and some of these sketches are more successful than others. You'll see as I finish them all up here, some of them got a little off the rails, and that's okay. I am learning this along with you. I'm practicing, and I think the more you just play around with it, you want to look at some photos maybe on Google Photos, study flowers in real life, and then just start working in your sketchbook and trying different things out. Does that petal look normal if you make it this long? Well, what if it's this short? What if it's this length? Where's it look most natural? When does it sort of hit that spot where you think, yes, that is what it would look like if that was sitting here in front of me right now? So it's all about play. Perspective can be frustrating and weird, but once I think you'll get it, it's very rewarding. And don't forget, you can practice this in your sketchbook, and if you get a couple flowers that you're like, oh, that's perfect, I really nailed it, trace it, and then use that graphite transfer paper to transfer it into your journal or your good copy sketchbook or whatever it is. I'm adding a few stems to these guys, just doing thin double line. And then speaking of stems, I guess we should talk about the leaves of the anemone. And they're just sort of very scraggly, very much like a ranunculus leaf. Actually, I wouldn't be surprised if this is part of the ranunculus family. And so you can see here, I sort of shake the pen a little as I'm illustrating these leaves to make them very jagged and a little bit messy. And I like to darken them, just having the dark leaves and then the lighter colored petals of the flowers causes a nice contrast in our piece. And I'll do a larger leaf so you can kind of see what I'm doing, but that's kind of the idea, very jagged, shaking the pen, making everything just a little messy and definitely very perfectly imperfect. Okay, so now that we've drawn the flower together and we've talked a bit about perspective, let's try to do one together. So I've started here with a circle in the middle, and then I'm sketching these petals coming out from that circle. I've made the two petals in the front a lot shorter, and I'm going to add some little jagged leaves. We're going to do this in pen so you guys can really see. But I've got those two petals in the front and they're quite short. The top one there being the largest and the ones on the side are sort of in between. I'm going to go around and add that sort of halo of other petals. And then I will start to color in that stamen, doing lots of little lines, adding a bit of a squiggly line around the base to make sure it doesn't look too perfectly round. And then of course I will add the stem, and we'll just do a thin double line. I'm adding these jagged leaves, and they're gonna be darker where the petals will be lighter, so we'll get some nice contrast. So just sort of going over everything we've already talked about. I'm going to do that halo or that circle fanning out of all those tiny little lines, and then I will add the dots. That's the fun part. And then of course I will use my smaller nib, the smaller nib pen, to add lots and lots of line shading. And you can see this coming together here. I'm just going along with the shape of the petals, adding the line shading to show shadow, to show depth, to show the shape and texture of each petal. So there's lots of reasons for doing that. And that's what it looks like when it's all done. Now we've done some practice. We've tried this flower a whole bunch of different ways. Let's work in a fresh sketchbook and let's do a final piece. We've got the other one there as a guide sitting right beside us. And I've sketched a few flowers here, done them in pencil first. Some of them are on just a bit of an angle. We'll put a tiny smaller petal in the front there. You can always add that one in later. So if you're struggling with your perspective, that's a good trick. Lay down those 4 or 5 petals and then maybe add a few shorter ones on top, lying right on top. I think that can be kind of helpful. And I am going to start going over all of my outlines. I barely need to talk you guys through this at this point because we've done it so many times on the practice page, but that dark stamen in the center, you do this fanning out of all these tiny little lines, keeping a little bit of negative space between that major circle and the halo of lines or the fan of lines, adding those tiny dots, very, very perfectly imperfect. And then of course you've done your guide for each petal. You're gonna make the shape, going over it in pen, making it maybe a little jagged or a little pointed, or maybe there's an indent on the top of each petal. And of course you add those other petals in behind. They're sort of layers of petals to the anemone. And then I use my smaller nib, the Pigmamicron 01, to add more line shading. Of course, that helps with the shape of each petal, the texture of the petals, and also the layering of the petals. They're darker underneath where they meet, right? And this second flower here, you can see it's on even more of an angle than the first. The first one is almost two-dimensional, very flat. So this one, we've got the really short petal here, right on the left-hand side. And then I am doing the under petals, and then I'll continue with my line shading. So I've got my formula down at this point, and it doesn't mean I get everyone perfect, that's for sure, but those practice pieces really did help me. And at this point, I'm having more fun with the shape of the flower and with the line shading because I'm definitely feeling more confident and more comfortable. And you can see me continuing up here with the third one, and I have got this gorgeous stamen in the center here with all these dots and lines, a little bit of negative space. I've got jagged petals, doing my line shading. So as I said, you come up with a bit of a formula after a while, and that's a good feeling because then anytime you go to draw it, you sort of know exactly what you're all about and what you're going to do. And I'm just going to finish my final piece here by adding a few stems. I want them to all sort of come together at the bottom of the page, so I've planned for that. I'll add these jagged little rough looking leaves, scraggly leaves. I'm going to do a few right around the flower because that is how they often grow. They'll have these leaves sort of coming out from around the petals, around the blossom. And then of course they'll have some on the stem as well. So there we go, that's my finished piece. One flower did turn out a little bit oddly big, but that's okay. And that of course is the rough work that we had a bunch of fun with as well. Thank you guys so much for watching today. I hope you feel confident drawing the anemone flower, and I will see you soon with a new tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe.